Okay, let's begin the first session. So we all know most of the clinical decisions nowadays is based on laboratory findings, and in fact, even simple diagnosis of diabetes, be it malaria, or even the present-day epidemic, pandemic, diagnosis of corona, COVID. So everything is almost influenced by laboratory data. And as with anything, if you are relevant, if you rely on too much on any one particular aspect, then the chances of error also multiplies, the magnitude increases, and as given by a statement in a 2005 article, which says errors related to laboratory testing are too common and constitute a significant fraction of diagnostic errors in the medicine today. So before actually going to the what are the errors or the collection of sample, let's take few scenarios. When you come across first scenario, I believe most of the students here are clinicians, and a few of them are from non-medical background. Anyway, let's address the majority first. The scenario one, in elderly male patient comes to your OPD, a chronic kidney disease, and comes up with his reports, and you see there is a hyperkalemia. The patient has no symptoms as such of hyperkalemia, and you are in a fix whether to taper the doses of your antihypertensive or specific to potassium sparing diuretic. Scenario two, the same patient, if he has come up with hyperkalemia, hypocalcemia, and almost undetectable levels of alkaline phosphatase. This can also happen in your clinical practice. Or a patient has come up, the same patient has come up with a follow-up. In the first follow-up, you have noticed that the creatinine has increased, almost doubled, while the urea has remained the same. And in a different scenario, the platelet count, which was normal in the morning, in the evening, by the time of evening rounds, without any clinical signs and symptoms, the platelets have gone to deficiency level. So there is a thrombocytopenia in the report. Or in a different scenario where the APTT results are consistently coming abnormal, while the PT results are also abnormal, and the patient does not have any history of any bleeding or taking any anticoagulants. So all these scenarios, and even a patient who is on Eptoin consistently showing lower than therapeutic levels of the drug. So all these scenarios can be linked to somewhere to sample collection, processing, and as well as the interpretation. So as we go on with the lecture, we will address these scenarios. So let's begin with the sample journey. The sample journey begins from the time you conceive what are the investigations that you want to raise for a patient, and the sample collection, it goes through many channels, comes to a laboratory, from the staff to technologists, even the machines, and then finally validation by the clinicians, pathologists, and then it is released. So if you see here, this is a Swiss cheese model. There are a lot many deficiencies here, but when all the deficiencies are lined up, if all the persons go unchecked, if all the process goes unchecked, then there is a chance of error. And when there is an error, then it grabs the attention of all the people around, be it media or the council or even consumer courts. So as I told you here, it is the persons, basically it's indicating the people involved in it, because so people involved in it, because of the analytical error rate over the past decade has gone down drastically. When I say analytical error, it is the measurement error, or when it is happening with the automation or the machine. If you see in late 1990s, the errors were more than 16 lakh per million tested. Well, nowadays it is less than 40 errors per million tests performed. So where is the majority of the errors occurring? So majority of the errors are occurring at the level of pre-analytical and pre-analytical. They constitute up to 70%. Pre-analytical error is raising errors, inappropriate test, whereas the pre-analytical error is using a inappropriate Vacutainer. One example. So there are other errors which constitutes majority are post-analytical errors and post-analytical errors. That is, even after the getting the reports, if you're not taking action, then also it constitutes error. So as the Lao Tzu in his Art of War book says, the journey of 1,000 miles begin with first step or the one step. So let's begin with the samples journey. So in this half an hour lecture, I'm not going to make you an expert in sample collection. However, it is a skill and it is an art and it has to be learned with practice. However, I'm going to tell few pointers so that you can get maximum out of the lab. That is when to take the sample, how to take the sample, how to send the sample with respect to different investigations. So with respect to pathology as concerned, pathology has different laboratories under its umbrella, be it the bone marrow lab, hematology lab, coagulation laboratory, or clinical chemistry, or histopathology, cytopathology, or even electron microscopy. By this time, you must all be familiar with this screen, especially those who are on the clinical side who are raising requests for different tests day in, day out. So here you can select the department and all the different services offered by that particular department you can see in the drop down. Similarly, there are many departments in the institute, nearly up to 30 departments. They are having their own laboratories catering different needs of clinicians, and you can select those departments as well as raise the request. One thing is common to all of these labs is definitely most common sample sent to a lab will be blood, and there are general instructions that one has to follow while sending a blood sample. That is, you need to explain the patient before taking the sample, what for what test and what are the preparations that the patient should follow. For example, if it is a fasting sample, you need to instruct the patient to be in a fasting state so that you can send the sample in the fasting state in the morning. And if you should raise the requisition with relevant information, use proper labeling, and ensure timely delivery of the labs. We are very fortunate to be in this institute. The sample are being transported using pneumatic system. So one thing is automatically taken care of. The things that you have to either you are taking the sample or you are witnessing the sample being collected by the sisters in the bedside. So if you look at this picture, obviously sampling is being done. He's wearing all the precautions and he's taking the sample. But if you see, the patient is not in a comfortable position and is standing and the blood is being drawn. And in fact, there is no tourniquet and the patient himself is using his hand as holding his arm. So these things lead to a lot of errors, especially if you are interested in measuring hemoglobin, hematocrit, because of the hemo concentration, and even ESR values will get altered. Even you cannot go with your coagulation reports. So ideally, the patient should be in a comfortable position, seated, and the tourniquet should be tied at least 2 inches above the point of venipuncture. And the most anterior cubital vein is the most commonly used vein. And however, you can use the other veins also if there is a difficulty in accessing it. You should bear in mind to avoid any areas which having scarring or hematoma. Already there is indwelling IV cannula, or if there is an edema or burn, or if the patient has undergone a total lymphadenectomy like a CA breast, or a patient has the fistula on the hand because of the needed for the dialysis. So you need to avoid those hands and take the sample from the opposite hand. It is best to use multi-sample needle and the needle holder so that the appropriate amount of blood automatically gets filled into the vacutainer, and as well as easy to change tubes without drawing out the needle, as in contrast with the needle where you use a syringe. So there are, apart from the timing of the sample, there are many other things which can affect the results. That is the tube in which you are sending for the testing. If you are sending for glucose measurement and you are sending it in a plain vial and it is not processed within few hours, then the glucose values will definitely go down. because of the cellular elements in the blood will start consuming the glucose in the blood. So you need to choose appropriate vacutainers, and you should transport the samples in appropriate temperature. For example, certain tests such as PTH, the needs to be ammonia needs to be sent in ice chilling, and you need to avoid hemolysis and storage also. Sometimes you might take the sample in the night or a previous day or in the morning, and you want to send it later. So you will be storing the samples depending on the test that you are performing. You are asking. So the storage conditions differs. So what are the common errors that we come across in lab is collection tube not properly filled. Especially like if you see in this EDTA vial sent for hemogram. The amount of blood present in this vial is too less, and it cannot be aspirated even manually, resulting in any proper laboratory values for the clinician, which is useful. In fact, every vacutainer comes with a mark, and that mark you have to check whether it is filled up to there. If the tube is expired, yeah, if you have to see, check for these marks, and the blood should be filled up to the mark over the vacutainer. And if the tube has expired, then the vacuum has been lost, and automatically the blood will not get filled to the mark. Apart from the use of appropriate vacutainers, there is also a specific order you need to draw the sample. In the order of draw, first, especially if the patient is undergoing blood culture, then it has to be the first sample to be drawn. And the second one will be the citrated vial for coagulation studies, because the prolonged activation or the prolonged tourniquet can lead to activation of platelets and release of tissue factors from the blood vessel, which can activate the clotting factors and resulting in erroneous PT and APTT results. So if there is no blood culture investigation raised, the first thing that you have to think of is the citrated tube, and then the plain tube, and then the SST, that is the serum separator tube or a gel tube commonly known as, and then comes your heparin, and then EDTA, and the last will be fluoride. So this order is very important, because if you take the blood sample at the end, you might end up with contamination, because you will be constantly touching the vena puncture area. Or if a citrated tube is used later, I already told you there is activation of clotting factors. If EDTA is used prior to the plain sample, the EDTA is a very strong chelator, and the contamination of the successive sample with the EDTA can lead to chelation of divalent ions such as calcium and magnesium. And this EDTA is actually having potassium also as an additive, and potassium can also spill onto the next tube through the multi-sample needle and giving falsely high potassium levels. So the order of draw goes from left to right here. So next factor that is going to affect the results are storage. If you store a sample for the EDTA sample for more than 6 hours, it is going to affect the different parameter, its red blood cell indices, as well as because the RBC starts to swell, and the PCV, the packed cell volume will increase, the mean corpuscular volume will also increase, and ESR will also get affected. While the TLC, because the cells start to degenerate and resulting in leukopenia, false leukopenia, and as well as the platelet counts will go down. Because with time, the reticulocyte sites, even in vitro conditions, will mature, so you will have a falsely low reticulocyte count. So you need to check for the proper storage. If you are in, say, one more example, if you are sending a sample for coagulation studies and the sample is refrigerated prior to centrifugation, this will lead to loss of labile factors, especially factor 5 and factor 8, which are responsible for APTT prolonged will be there. So they are responsible for intrinsic pathway and resulting in the prolongation of APTT values, and you may end up falsely diagnose the patient with as hemophilia or Van Willebrand's disease. So if I go back to the scenario which I had initially shown, the first scenario, you can see that there is a hemolysis. This hemolysis commonly you can find in your reports a comment that hemolysis is there, mild, moderate. Hemolysis can happen because either the sample was not set for a 10 to 15 minutes before being shipped, or if the sample is forcefully injected into the tube, or if it is immediately brought in contact with the ice cold material. So can lead to hemolysis, and hemolysis can not only lead to rise in potassium values, but and also can lead to rise of other parameters such as LDH can also go high. In scenario 2, as it says, the potassium is high, calcium is low, alkaline phosphatase, which requires magnesium as a cofactor, so which is a divalent ion. So it shows is the wrong order of draw. EDTA sample is being drawn before the plain tube. In the scenario 3, the clinical history was missing. Actually, the patient was on a fenofibrate, which is known to interfere with analytical assays and giving falsely high values. And platelet, as I've already told you, either due to inadequate mixing or prolonged storage with the EDTA or inappropriate volume. If the EDTA is more, can lead to aggregation of these platelets, resulting in low platelet values. And PTA, PTT values, if there is a underfilling, if it is not filled to the mark, there will be anticoagulant excess in the tube because the proper ratio is not maintained, so resulting in prolonged APTT and PT values, giving false results. And EPTOIN consistently, it was being basically the sample was taken, it should have been sent in a plain tube without any gel or any additive. It was consistently being sent in a gel tube, which is getting absorbed in the gel. So entrapped in the gel, and the EPTOIN is not measured completely. So these are quite scenarios in that you can come across in a daily practice, which can be avoided if you are aware of it. So sometimes lab do reject the samples for all the reasons which are mentioned here. The hemolysis is one of the most commonly rejected sample. And then others also, if there is a clot in the sample, and also there is a wrong barcode label or wrong labeling, can also lead to rejection of the sample. And most of the time, leaky container, we can come across a broken vials or uncapped, so will be definitely rejected. So how to avoid hemolysis? I've already told you. It is don't push the blood into the vacutainer, withdraw slowly, and don't transfer it immediately into an ice cold chamber, and avoid prolonged tourniquet. There are a few tests which needs immediate chilling, and usually they are not SSTs, they are not taken in SST. They are lactic acid, pyruvate, and PTH, I've already told you, ammonia. Certain tests require sample transportation at 37 degrees. We can come across, especially during these times, the cold agglutinins and cryofibrinogens. And certain parameters needs protection from light, especially the bilirubin, all kinds of vitamins. And if you had got, or if you come across patient reports with vitamin D consistently low from a particular lab, probably they are sending the sample to a different laboratory, and where the samples are not protected from light and giving falsely low vitamin D levels. So if that is with the blood collection. And the urine collection, there are different types of urine collection. It is a random collection or a timed collection. Random collection, it is any after 3 to 4 hours after the patient has last urinated, where the timed collection may be a 24-hour collection or 1 to 2 hours collection. Random collection, you can also say as a spot urine, and timed collection, most commonly that we follow is 24-hour collection. You should give proper instruction to the patient before collecting the sample. If it is a random sample, the patient should preferably give a midstream sample in a 20 to 30 ml plastic sterile container, and it should also have a tight cap. Otherwise, the CO2 diffusion occurs and resulting in a change in the pH. pH is very important, especially in urine, because certain crystals are found in either acidic or alkaline media. Especially the Staghorn calculus can be found in the protease infection, which is an alkaline medium. The random urine sample is good for freshly voided sample is good for the RBCs and WBCs. And delay in the transport of urine sample will lead to change in the pH of the urine and also bacterial growth. So if you are intending to get a bacterial colony count, then you have get falsely evaluated bacterial growth. So these are the different containers that you come across for urine collection. For 24-hour collection, you need to give proper instruction to the patient that from the moment he has voided the last urine, from that moment he has to count the next 24 hours. Before submitting the sample at that particular hour, he has to void and then submit it. He doesn't have to submit the whole urine that he has collected. Just allocate of 20 to 30 ml is enough. One of the best website you can get instructions for sample collection and transportation is labtestonline.org, which is actually maintained by American Association of Clinical Chemistry. And at a glance, it gives all the information related to the test. That is why the person is getting tested, or when to get tested, the sample required, and any preparation. In our department, we also have a cytopathology section, and we do receive specimens of FNA, USG guided FNA, pap smears, sputum cytology, fluid cytology, squash cytology, and imprint cytology. While squash and imprint cytology are intraoperative specimens, and we do get samples, slides for review, which are done outside, and we do review the cytology slides. For fine needle aspiration, it is performed by the Department of Pathology itself, and the timing between 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. In Saturdays differs, 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. The clinician need to mark the area from which the FNA needs to be made. Is area of interest, and mention in the form whether the patient has been tested for HIV or known contact. Most of the time it is missed. It is better in your interest of your own colleague. Other is guided FNAC, and it is done on Mondays and Thursdays with an appointment and performed in the radiology department. And separate forms are there for FNAC and as well as guided FNAC. So the apparatus is used for taking the FNAC sample. So the important point is you need to fix the swelling that you are interested in taking the sample or the FNA, so that it does not move and patient in a comfortable position. You need to make immediately the smear using the slides available there, and you need to immediately send it in a alcohol based jar. And if there is any excess material, then you have to express it into another container containing the normal saline. So one more thing that is important while raising the form is that you come across the clinical history. Although it says it's mandatory, we hardly get any clinical history. Clinical history is very important, especially with the cytology or histopathology, and before giving any opinions. If you are getting a thyroid FNA done and you have not mentioned any clinical history or the previous lab results, what is ultrasounding finding, so these things will delay the release of the reports. If you are suspecting tuberculosis, or you are suspecting any metastatic lymph node nodule, and if you have not mentioned it, so the unnecessary delay in the release of results. And if you are initially properly mentioned, like a tuberculosis, the consultant might even ask for additional AFB staining even before it is being raised from your end. So it is a mandatory information, and try to give as much as possible, which can aid the pathologist. Then fluids, definitely we do get many fluids, be it urine, serous cavity fluids, and even CSF. It should be sent a fresh specimen and in a clean, dry, and sterile container. If you cannot send immediately, store at 4 degrees. Please properly label the specimens and send at least 100 ml. For CSF, you can send up to 2 to 5 ml. Here, the order of draw is not as same as in blood. The cell count, especially in CSF, you will send the third bottle, third container. In the first container, you might want to get the chemistry done. In the second container, you might want to get the culture done. If for delay is unavoidable, it is better to add 50% ethanol, an equal amount, and store it. And it is all the specimens, the fluids, it's better to send it in any kind of anticoagulant. Either it is heparin with 5 to 10 units, or 10 ml of fluid in 1 ml of sodium citrate, or add 1 mg of EDTA. Most commonly, you can use heparin or sodium citrate. For sputum cytology, it is better to get a spontaneous fresh morning sample with a deep cough. It is better within 15 to 30 minutes after waking up or before taking breakfast. Brushing of the teeth or rinsing of mouth thoroughly with water will reduce the contamination with saliva. 3 successive specimens of sputum, send it in a wet fixed smears in a coupling jar, and a fresh sample in a wide mouth sterile water without any additive. For cytology specimen, it is especially the pap smears. It is sent in a coupling jar with a 95% ethanol. And for reviewing of the slides with proper relevant information needs to be mentioned in the form, and the copy of the previous report if available. For intraoperative cytology, we do get requests from Department of Neurosurgery most of the times for sparse cytology, for medulloblastoma, glioblastoma, and all. And imprint cytology, we do request for get from lymph nodes, and for the whether confirmation of malignancy for liver nodule and all. So it is better to communicate with the lab before sending these samples with the follower landline numbers. And the specimen needs to be sent in normal saline, and mention the contact number or the CUG number of the resident. It is because we can communicate, because intraoperative procedures, we can communicate the results as early as possible. And following the surgery, you can send histology remnant of the tissue. For histopathology labs, we get different size specimens following the procedures. And the most important point to remember here, you used to use 10% buffer saline and to submerge the tissue completely and tighten the lid securely, because the tissue needs to be fixed in the formalin. If it is improperly filled or the lid is not securely tightened, the loss of formalin or the tissue will not get fixed, and it can lead to artifacts. Other important factor points to note down is you need to mark the margins. For example, you are sending the sample for Hirschsprung's disease suspecting, and if you are not marked the proximal and distal end, so it can lead to confusions. So label the container properly with the patient name and as well as the CR number, because 2 identifiers is always act as a backup for one. And what is the tissue that you are sending? And please don't write it on the lid, because the lid can get lost, but not the container. So these are various, we do get specimens in all kinds of container, depending on the size of it. So if it is a hollow organ, very massive organ, it is better to cut it and let the formalin get into the tissue and send as early as possible. If the delay is unavoidable, we can section the specimen properly so that the formalin gets into the tissue, and immerse the tissue in the formalin. So please do not refrigerate all these histopathology specimens. If you see, this was one of the requests that we got in the last year from a lung biopsy. You can see that there is lot many shiny things, white colored particles over here, and as well as black spots over there. So we didn't get any clinical history for this patient, and the form was quite, nothing was mentioned in the mandatory information. Just a simple dash was there, and the patient underwent lot many investigations because of this lesion. He underwent AFB staining, mycology, as well as even malignancy workup. But the thing is that if a clinical history was mentioned that is person working in some kind of factory where the chances of pneumoconiosis is there, and if X-ray findings would have been given, so it would have aided the pathologist in giving a correct opinion. Otherwise, specimens like this, without any clinical history and on histology, if we sign these kind of things, we will be giving a descriptive report which may not be of any help to you. So for intraoperative, again, we do receive frozen sections. Before sending the frozen sections, please inform the lab and send tissue in normal saline. Mark with a suture or a ink and transport it immediately. And mention the contact number or extension number so that the results can be communicated as possible. And please realize the limitations, because in frozen sections, we might not be able to give the complete diagnosis, but it is just to aid the intraoperative decision. We do get slides and blogs from outside to review, and please attach the previous report and all the relevant information as with the cytology review. For rapid processing, we do get rapid for, especially in case of renal transplant biopsies. And again, the same as in frozen section, the limitations are there. It is not a conclusive diagnosis, but it can help you taking immediate clinical decisions. Other kind of requests that we get are for immunofluorescence and IHC, that is immunohistochemistry, especially in malignancies. So it's always histology requisition is mandatory, and send a separate form for IHC, and it cannot be performed on review slides because we do need blocks for it. So if there are blocks are available, then we can perform IHCs. For immunofluorescence, it is especially from Department of Nephrology we do get, and for transplant and native kidney, please give proper labeling and send specimen in normal saline or a transport medium, and mark what are the investigations that is required. Most commonly IgG, IgM and IgA are requested, including the complements. Then we have electron microscopy lab also. Here the sample needs to be sent in a cold glutaraldehyde fixative only, and you should inform the lab because the container you need to get it from the lab, and it is available in the electron microscopy, and send the sample as early as possible after collection. So conclusion is there are lot many caveats and different processes, and when all things get aligned, then there is chances of error, and the only way that we can prevent this undesirable outcome is teaching everyone, being updated with the requirements of an individual test or the procedure is required, and communicating with each other. So as a team, if we share proper information and educate our colleagues or juniors and consistently assess their competency, we can solve our diagnostic errors from the lab. Thank you.